Good evening. It is very good to be here with you tonight. The last time I was here, it's been a few years now. The last time I was standing before you, and I have had a lot happen in my life since then. I am in this wheelchair now and will be for the rest of my life, but the Lord has allowed me to keep preaching, and I'm so very thankful for that. Sometimes when I go places, people will notice that on the back of my wheelchair, there is a third wheel in the middle. I call it my R2D2 wheel. And if you look at it, it's got blue lights down the middle, and people always say, "What is that thing?" It's called a smart drive. And it operates, it hooks on the back axle, and I have a wristband that I put on my wrist, and it operates on tapping. And so when I want to travel, when I want to speed up, I'll tap it and it will start. When I reach the speed I want, I will tap it and it will regulate. When I want to stop, I will tap it again. And so it is a magnificent device, and it helps me, particularly if I'm going to go up a steep hill. Sometimes if a hill is too steep, when you push, the wheelchair has a tendency to want to flip backwards. Well, with this, it will push me up a hill, but it's got problems because I have had occasions where I will forget that I've got it on, and I have been up on the pulpit, and I will tap the table, and it'll take off with me. On one occasion, I was at the funeral home, and I was gathered around talking with a group of people, and somebody came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Brother Don," and I plowed into a group of people right there in the funeral home. And so you have to be careful with it, and that's the reason I'm not wearing it right now. Sometimes people will notice that I will periodically, every few minutes, I will lift up like this, and they've said, "Why do you do that? Are you hurting?" And I tell them, no, the reason I do that is I want to see if anybody's sleeping while I'm speaking. I always, everywhere I go, ask me why I'm doing that. The reason for that is so that you don't get pressure sores. Normally, when a person's healthy, when you get sore, when you get uncomfortable, you change positions without even thinking about it. Since I don't feel it, I don't do that. And so they train you in the hospital. Every few minutes you got to lift up, and it just kind of becomes a habit to you. Enough of that. Rightly dividing the word. That's what we're talking about tonight. We're going to talk about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we're going to begin, and I got to turn it on here. There we go. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15, the Bible says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Now from this passage, I learned several things. Number one, I learned that God expects me to study. He says, "Study to show thyself approved." Secondly, I learned that if I don't study, then I should be ashamed. I should be ashamed before God, and truthfully, I should be ashamed before others. Thirdly, I learned that I have to properly divide the Word of God. Study to show thyself approved unto God, rightly dividing the Word of truth. Now, what does that mean that I'm going to rightly divide the Word? You tell me, what does it mean that I'm going to rightly divide the Word of God? What's that? Okay, what's binding on us? What's not binding on us? What applies to me? What doesn't apply to me? I have to know in the Bible there are different testaments. How many different testaments are there? 2, Old Testament, New Testament. There are different dispensations. How many of those are there? There are 3. We'll talk about those in just a minute. There are different covenants. There are different promises. There are different commands to different people at different times. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about here. If you think about covenants, a covenant is simply an agreement between two parties. That is, you do this and I'll do this. That's a covenant. There are many covenants in the Bible between God and man. For example, there is a covenant between God and Adam. God said to Adam, "Be fruitful and multiply. You dress and keep the garden. Don't eat of this tree. And I, in exchange, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to provide for you." Does that command apply to me? That command doesn't apply to me. That was a covenant between God and Adam. You have a covenant that took place between God and Noah. He said to Noah, build this ark. He said, I'm going to save you and your family. I want you to gather the animals. You go into the ark, and I'm going to save you. Does that apply to me? That doesn't apply to me. You've got a covenant between God and Abraham. God said to Abraham, leave your home, walk faithfully, sacrifice your son. I'm going to bless you and make your name great. Does that apply to me? You see, I've got to understand to whom the covenant was given and to whom it applies. And if I don't, I'm going to get mixed up about this. Now, we mentioned a moment ago that there are 3 different dispensations in the Bible. You've got first the patriarchal age, the patriarchal dispensation. This is the very first period of time. This is where God spoke to the fathers. The word father is where we get patriarch. That is the patriarchal dispensation. That began with Adam in the garden, and it goes until the Exodus. It was a family religion. The father is the head. He offered sacrifices for his children. You see that happening in the book of Job. There is no written law during this period. God communicated to the father. They had animal sacrifices as a part of this. This time period covered Adam. It covered Cain and Abel. It covered Abraham. It covered the time that the children of Israel were in Egypt. Secondly, you can see the second dispensation, and that is the Mosaic. This is the law of Moses. It began at Mount Sinai right after they came out from the Exodus. It goes until the cross. Technically, it goes until the day of Pentecost. We'll talk about that more in a minute. The law of Moses was given to Moses. It included the 10 Commandments. It covers the time period of Moses, Joshua, the judges, the kings, the divided kingdom, the Old Testament from the book of Exodus unto Malachi, and it covers the life of Jesus. Jesus lived under the Old Testament period. Then you've got the third dispensation, the third age, and that is the Christian age. This was made official at the cross, but it went into effect in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. There were no more animal sacrifices. Now, we have to rightly divide the word. That means I have to know what applies to them, and I have to know what applies to me. Today, we don't live under the patriarchal system. But you know what? That's generally understood. I have never, in almost 30 years of preaching, ever had anybody argue with me about that. Nobody's ever said, well, we've got to go back and get things from the patriarchal system. Secondly, we don't live under the Mosaic system. Colossians 2:14 says that it was nailed to the cross. Listen to this. Galatians 3 and verse 24 says that the law of Moses was a tutor to bring us to Christ, but after faith has come, that is the system of faith, that is Christianity, after Christianity has come, we are, quote, no longer under the tutor. We're not under the law of Moses anymore. But listen to me. There's a lot of confusion about this point. There's a lot of people who will agree we're not under the law of Moses anymore, but they want to pick and choose certain parts of the law of Moses and bind them on us today. Can you think of some things from the Old Testament law that people want to pick and apply to us today? Sabbath day, that's one for sure. I hear that one. What else? Instrumental music, that is probably one of the top ones. People go back to the Old Testament to find instrumental music. What else? Can you think of any others? What's that? I can't understand what you're saying, but... Oh, anointing of oil. With those masks on, it's hard to understand people. I have heard that one. How about tithing? Don't people go back and get tithing from the Old Testament? How about the 10 Commandments? Don't people go back and get the 10? All the time, people are going back and taking things from the Old Testament. In fact, when I was preaching at the church at North Charleston, we had a Facebook page, and there was someone who was a seminary student who made a statement on our Facebook page, and I put it up here. Oh, that's not it. I want you to see what he said. He said this. He found it very objectionable, the idea that we don't live under the Old Testament or that it doesn't apply to us. And this is what he wrote on our page. Only the ceremonial laws were done away. Things like animal sacrifices, specific things like the priest duties, etc. He said the moral laws and the rest of the Old Testament remained in force. Now, as a Christian, do you know how to answer that? What do you say when somebody says to you, only the ceremonial aspects of the law have been done away? Do you know what to say to that? Now, we're supposed to rightly divide the word. What is Old Testament and what is New Testament? And so we need to know how to answer this. One of the things I wanted to show you here, if I can, let me see if I can pull this up. I was going to pull it up there, but I think that it's going to be too hard for me to read it. Let me see. This is going to be tricky. Okay, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it up here at the last minute, so we'll just skip it here. All right, one of the most hotly debated areas and most misunderstood things about the Old Testament comes down to the Ten Commandments. And so I want to start there, and we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments. These are the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And thou shalt not covet. These 10 statements make up what is called the 10 Commandments. Sometimes it's called the Decalogue. You can find this in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. This was given on stone tablets to Moses and the children of Israel at, can you tell me, where did Moses receive these? Mount Sinai, that's right. When they exited Egypt, they came to Mount Sinai, and God gave these to Moses. Listen what I'm about to say. Many people believe still today that these 10 Commandments contain the fullness of man's responsibilities toward God. And if I'm going to go to heaven today, it's going to be by keeping these 10 Commandments. Brethren, I want to tell you that is not true today, and it has never been true. Even in the days of the old law, these 10 Commandments did not comprise the fullness of God's law toward men. The 10 Commandments, did you realize, were just a small portion of the law of Moses? If you go back, somebody has counted this, and they will tell you, if you look at the whole of the Old Testament law, there were a lot more than 10 Commandments. In fact, does anybody know how many there were? Anybody know? In addition to the 10 Commandments, there were another 603 directives under the law of Moses. 613 directives. So even in the days when the 10 Commandments were in effect, they were not the fullness of God's law toward men. And so the question I want to start with tonight is I'm going to tackle just this, and we're going to answer the other question as we go. Are we under the 10 Commandments today? Are the 10 Commandments binding on us? Because, what's that? 9 of them? All right. It's a good statement. Unless we'll talk about that momentarily. A lot of people believe the 10 Commandments are binding on us today. In fact, to suggest that the 10 Commandments are not binding on us today will upset a lot of people. In fact, that's why we have these debates, sometimes out in front of a courthouse. They'll have the 10 Commandments, and there'll be a lawsuit about that. And they'll go to court about this issue. Why? Because some people say this is God's law for us today, and then, of course, the atheists don't like it, and there will be a big fight over this. What I want to tell you is this, and I want you to hang on because it might surprise some of you, but we're going to explain it as we go. We do not live under the 10 Commandments today. Now, I'm going to give you the reasons why as we go. We're going to begin with this. Can you all read that all right? Why the Ten Commandments are not binding on us today. Number one, the Ten Commandments were given to Israel, not to us. Shortly after the children of Israel came out of Egypt, Moses ascended up to Mount Sinai to receive these 2 tablets of stone that contained the Ten Commandments. These commandments are recorded in Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Exodus chapter 20 is when God first gave the Ten Commandments. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, God rehearsed them again to the children of Israel before they went into the land of Egypt. Before reciting the commandments on that occasion, this is what Moses said. I've got it up here on the board, Deuteronomy 5, 2 and 3. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us. Now listen how he emphasizes this. Not with our fathers, but with us, even us who are alive here this day. Could he have made that any more specific? He said, not our fathers, us. Specifically, us who are alive here this day. Moses made this very clear. Why are we not under the Ten Commandments? They weren't given to us. Here's a second one. The Ten Commandments are a part of the old law that has been done away. Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah 31:31, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their father in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Now think about that for a minute. In Jeremiah 31:31, he said, I'm going to make a new covenant. Not the covenant that I made with them when they came out of Egypt, not the covenant that I made with your fathers. What did we just read in Deuteronomy chapter 5? Moses said this was given to us, not to our fathers, but to us. Then Jeremiah says we're going to have a new law, not the one that was made when they came out of Egypt, but it's going to be a new law. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 23 says, but before faith came, that is the Christian system, we were kept under the law. That is the law of Moses. We were shut up unto the faith that should come afterward. Wherefore, the law of Moses was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ that we may be justified by faith. Now listen to verse 25. But after the faith has come, that is the Christian system of faith, we are no longer under the schoolmaster. He says the law of Moses was a schoolmaster. After Christianity has come, we're not under the schoolmaster. We're not under the law of Moses. So what does that mean? It means in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 9, he said, he took away the first that he may establish the second. How many testaments did we say there were? 2. He took away the first that he may establish the second. Colossians 2:14 says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, he took it out of the way and did what? Nailed it to the cross. Y'all been taught well here, I can tell that. Nailed it to the cross. And lest anybody miss the point, the Lord makes this abundantly clear in Matthew chapter 17. Because they're on the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John are present on the mountain. And you remember who appears on the mountain? Moses and Elijah. And Peter says, oh, Lord, let me build 3 tabernacles. One for you, Lord, one for Moses, one for Elijah. In essence, Peter was placing each of them at the same level. And a voice came from heaven and said, this is my beloved Son, hear ye him. Now, what was the point of that? The point is, Christ's law is binding on us today. Not the prophets, not Elijah, not the law of Moses. They're not equal. You listen to Christ. In Matthew 28:18, Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and in earth. And so if Moses and his Decalogue were still in effect today, then they don't have any authority today. Because Jesus said, I have all authority. And so I think it's important to notice God didn't say, mostly I want you to hear Christ, but I still want you to listen to Moses and a part of his law, because part of it's still in effect. It's not what he says. He says, all authority has been given to Christ. We're not under the 10 Commandments today. Here's a third reason. Because it is specifically stated in the New Testament that were not under the Ten Commandments. Now, this is the one, when I'm studying with people coming out of denominations, they're stunned by this. They will say, well, you're saying the Old Testament's been done away. I agree with that, but not the Ten Commandments. And I'll say, I can show you some passages that specifically say this. And they'll say, where? Let's see them. I want to begin in Romans chapter 7, and we're specifically going to look at verse number 4. Paul tells the Romans that they have become dead to the law, that is the law of Moses, by the body of Christ, that they may be married to another. Now, when he says you are dead to the law of Moses, does that sound like it's operative in any way? Does it sound like it's operative just a little bit? Part of it's still alive? He says you are dead to the law of Moses. Now, somebody says, but Don, how do you know that includes the Ten Commandments? Look down to verse number 6. He says, but now we are delivered from the law. What law? The law of Moses, that being dead to sin. Now look at verse number 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin, the law of Moses? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin except by the law of Moses, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. He says, we are dead to the law of Moses. And then he cites an example of the law to which we're dead, and the example that he says is, thou shalt not covet. Where do you find that? Thou shalt not covet. It's one of the Ten Commandments. He says, we are dead to the law. Specifically, he says, we're dead to the law that says, thou shalt not covet. He specifically states we are dead to the law, including the Ten Commandments. How do you get around that? Let's look at another passage. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and I want you to notice verse number 7. He says, but if the ministration of death that was written and engraven on stones was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance. Now, the language there is a little bit confusing, because when he talks about the ministration of death, you would think, what is the ministration of death? But he explains it to us. The ministration of death that was written and engraven on stones. What did they have that was written and engraven on stones? Yeah, I just showed you a picture of it a minute ago. That was a picture of the actual Ten Commandments. I'm just kidding. It was written and engraven on stones. Now, somebody might say, I don't know if that's the Ten Commandments. Keep reading. He says, it was so glorious that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the countenance of Moses for the glory of his countenance. What the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance. What does that mean? They said, when these stones, whatever he's talking about that was written on stone, he said at that point in time, the children of Israel couldn't even look at the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance. What is that talking about? What's that? Okay, the presence of God. Moses had been in the presence of God when he got the Ten Commandments. And do you remember when he came down from Mount Sinai, what happened? What did he look like? His face was, King James says his face shone. His face was shiny, and they were scared of it. Why was his face shiny? Because he'd been in the presence of God. He's making this very specific. He says, it has been done away. What's been done away? That which was written on stones. What are you talking about? Well, you remember when Moses came down from the mountain and he was holding the stones and his face was shining? Is he narrowing this thing down? There is no doubt what he's talking about. He says, that is what I'm talking about. Now, you skip down a little bit to verses 11 and 13, and he says, this thing that I'm describing that was written on stones when Moses' face was glowing, in verse 11 it says, it has been done away. In verse 13 it says, it has been abolished. Have the Ten Commandments been done away? Yes, they were written on stone. That's when his face was glowing. Have they been abolished? Yes. Brethren, I'm telling you, the Bible is very, very clear that we don't live under the Ten Commandments today. Now, here's the next point. I want to talk about, I can't see that back there. Yes, this is it. The consequences What if we were to still bind the Ten Commandments today? I want you to just ponder this with me. What if the Sabbath day was still bound today? The fourth of the Ten Commandments says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, neither your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your cattle, or your stranger that's in your gate. Exodus 20, verses 9 and 10. What was the penalty? Does anybody remember what the penalty was if you violated the Sabbath day? You were to be put to death. Exodus 31, 12 and 16. In fact, we have an example of that in Numbers chapter 15 and verse 32, because we read about a man who went out and he picked up sticks on the Sabbath day. Do you remember what happened? They went to Moses and they said, Moses, we got a guy who's picking up sticks on the Sabbath day. What do we do with him? What was the penalty? They put this man to death. They stoned him to death. In fact, on the Sabbath day, you were not even allowed to start a fire. If the Sabbath day was still binding on us today, a woman could not even turn on her gas range to prepare breakfast or to prepare lunch because you could not kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. And you know what? It wasn't just the Sabbath day that had the death penalty. Now listen to what I'm going to say, because this might surprise you. Did you know that every one of the Ten Commandments had the death penalty linked to it? Number 1 and 2. Commandments 1 and 2 dealt with idolatry. Do you know what the punishment for idolatry was? Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11, capital punishment. Commandment number 3 dealt with taking the Lord's name in vain. You know what the punishment for that was? Leviticus 24, verses 10 through 15, the death penalty. Number 4, the Sabbath day. What is the punishment? We just did that one. It's the death penalty. Number 5, honoring your father and your mother, obeying your parents. You know what the penalty was if you didn't obey or you dishonored your parents? What was the penalty in the Old Testament if you dishonored your parents? It's a death penalty. We'd have a lot of dead kids now, wouldn't we? Because, in fact, wouldn't that change our society if that were in effect today? The next one, number 7, was, number 6, murder. What was the punishment for murder? It was the death penalty, Exodus 21 and verse 2. What about adultery? What was the punishment for adultery? Leviticus 20 and verse 10. You know what's interesting about that? If you look at Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 13, this included homosexuality. Boy, times have changed, haven't they? Under the Old Testament, punishment for homosexuality was death. In our culture today, we celebrate it, and we say it's a great thing. As a matter of fact, if you don't support it, then we say you are a hater and you are a narrow-minded bigot. Next, number 8 and number 10, theft and coveting. You remember a man named Achan who coveted and he stole, Joshua chapter 7? What happened to Achan? Every one of the 10 Commandments had the death penalty associated with it. Now here's the thing. If these are still in effect today, who's going to put these people to death? Who's going to do it if the old law is still in effect? Here's the next thing I want you to get. If the 10 Commandments are still in effect, we have to understand this. If they are still in effect, then the whole law is still in effect. Why do I say that? Because Galatians chapter 5 and verse 3, the Apostle Paul lays down a principle for us, and it's this. Acceptance of part of the law of Moses, specifically he's talking about circumcision there, but acceptance of one part demands that you keep all of it. This is what he says, for I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to the whole law. What does that mean? They were trying to go back and say, well, as Christians, you still have to be circumcised. We're still going to bind that. And what Paul says is, if you take one, you got to take it all. If you're going to bind one part, you got to bind all of it. And so if the 10 Commandments are still bound, you know what that means? Then all of it is still bound. Here's the next one. If the 10 Commandments are still bound, then that implies that we have more than one lawgiver. If the Ten Commandments are still binding on us today, then Moses is still a lawgiver. And if the law of Christ is still binding on us today, then Christ is a lawgiver. And that means we're under two lawgivers, and Romans 7 says that means we're married to both. But James chapter 4 and verse 12 specifically says there is one lawgiver. And Romans 7 and verse 4 says that if we are holding to both, we are committing spiritual adultery. You know what that means? We're not under the Ten Commandments today. Now, this is the point that we want to make. Today, we live under the law of Christ. Today, we live under a better covenant. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 6 says this, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises." Now, here is the quibble that sometimes people will make. Sometimes people will, when you point out that we don't live under the Ten Commandments today, their response goes something like this. They will say, "So you're saying it's okay to worship idols today? You're saying it's okay to take the Lord's name in vain? You're saying it's okay to dishonor your parents today? It's okay to murder? It's okay to commit adultery?" Friends, that's not the logical conclusion. Do people know so little about the Bible that they think the Ten Commandments are the only source of moral authority? We don't teach that it's okay today for man to do those things, but we don't teach it because the law of Moses taught it. What do we teach? Well, the Clark mentioned this a moment ago, and that is 9 out of the 10 commandments are also taught in the New Testament. Isn't that right? Let's look at this. Commandments 1 and 2 prohibit having any other gods before you, and they say that we must refrain from idolatry. If you read in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 4 and 10, Jesus commanded worship and service to God only. Acts chapter 10, 25 and 26, Peter forbade that man worship him. Colossians 2:18, Revelation 19 and verse 10, angel worship is prohibited. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 and 10, Galatians 5 and verse 20, Paul forbade idolatry. And so what do we have? In the New Testament, we are taught that we can't practice idolatry. So, is it okay to practice idolatry today? Why not? Is it because it's in the Ten Commandments? Because it's in the New Testament. We don't do it today because it's in the law of Christ, not because it's in the Ten Commandments. Here's the next one. This is number 3. Commandment number 3 says, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9, Jesus taught that God's name is to be hallowed. Ephesians 4 and verse 29, Colossians 4 and verse 6 says we're to avoid all types of wrong language. And so respect for God is something that we're to practice today. Is it because it's in the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments? Why? Why are we to honor God's name today? It's in the New Testament, not because Moses said it, but because Christ said it. Here's the next one. Commandment number 4 commands keeping the Sabbath day. Now, the Sabbath day was Saturday. It was the day of rest. It was a sign between God and Israel. What about in the New Testament? Where do we find that one? We don't find that one. So you know what? We don't teach that one. Why don't we teach that one? It's not in the New Testament. You see the pattern here? Each one of these things that we still teach, it's because it's in the New Testament, not because it's one of the Ten Commandments. Now, I want you to think about this. Many people in the denominational world teach that we still live under the Ten Commandments today. When they get to number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In it thou shalt not do any work. And they go through the list there. What do they do when they get to that one? They say, we got to keep the Ten Commandments. What do they do when they get to commandment number 4 about the Sabbath day? Okay. They have said, well, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. You ever heard that term, Christian Sabbath? What they mean by that, and the reason they're doing this, is they're still trying to bind the Ten Commandments. They don't know what to do when they get to the Sabbath day. So they say, well, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, and so we have to keep the Christian Sabbath. That is also where the rules have come from, that you can't do any work on Sunday. Why? Because they're saying Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. They're binding principles about the Sabbath day on Sunday. Did you know you cannot find anywhere in the New Testament the term Christian Sabbath? There's no such thing as Sunday being the Christian Sabbath. We don't teach the fourth commandment or the Sabbath day because it is not in the New Testament anywhere. Here is the next one. Number 5. It taught respect and honor your parents. In the New Testament, in Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. So, are children supposed to respect their parents today? Yes. Is it because it's one of the Ten Commandments? Why is it? It's in the New Testament. It's in the law of Christ. If we were following it because it was part of the Ten Commandments, we would also have to stone our children to death because those two things went together. The New Testament still teaches that we're to honor our parents. Now, Commandments 6 through 10, they legislate against murder, against adultery, against theft, against lying, against bearing false witness, against covetousness. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke against murder and adultery. In Romans chapter 13 and verse 9, listen to what the Apostle Paul says. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, we could go on, but the point is, we are not free to commit these evils today, but not because they're in the law of Moses, but because they are in the law of Christ. That is the thing that people get hung up on. In fact, it hasn't been 2 weeks ago, someone went roundabout, they called it GB, and they wanted to go roundabout with me about this because they said we're still under the Old Testament law. As I tried to point out that it's been nailed to the cross, he said, so you think it's okay for children to dishonor their parents? So you think it's okay? He was very indignant. So you think it's okay to steal? You think we can take the Lord's name in vain today? We need to be able to explain to people those things are not okay. But you know what? They weren't okay in the patriarchal system. They weren't okay in the Mosaic system. They're not okay in the law of Christ because each law forbade. Was murder okay in the patriarchal system? How do you know that? Cain and Abel, right in the very beginning, Cain murdered Abel and he was punished by God. It has always been a sin. All right, we're in the last 5 minutes. I want to come back to this Facebook statement that I mentioned at the beginning. This seminary student posted on our Facebook page, and he said, not all of the law of Moses has been done away, only the ceremonial laws. The moral laws have not been done away. Now that we've gone through this, can you answer his arguments? Sure, you ought to be able to now. Number 1, you can point out specifically that the 10 Commandments, the heart of the moral laws, have been done away. Romans chapter 7 and verse 6 says, specifically cites, thou shalt not covet, as an example of a law that's been done away. It's been replaced in the New Testament with a law that says, thou shalt not covet, but it doesn't have the punishments associated with it. And 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 13 specifically says that which was written and engraven in stones has been done away. 10 Commandments has been done away. You can point out to this person, Galatians chapter 5 and verse 3 says, if one part of the law is binding, then all of it's binding. So he says, only the ceremonial parts are done away. The rest of it is still there. It's not what Paul says. Paul says if one part is binding, then it is all binding. And if Romans chapter 7 and verse 4 says, if we are still bound by the law of Moses, then we are guilty of spiritual adultery. Now, one more thing, and I'm going to wrap up the lesson. It will be yours. This man was very disturbed by the idea that the Old Testament law was completely taken away, and he argued this. He said, well, Jesus said the opposite. Jesus said that the law is still in force. You want to know what verse he used? Here it is. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. He said, Jesus said, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. He said, see, Jesus didn't take away the old law. It is still in force. Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the old law. I came to fulfill it. What do you say to that? Let me give you one of the best examples that I know of this. A couple of years ago, we laid new hardwood floors in our house, and I had them come out, and they measured, and then they wrote up a contract, and I paid them. And then they came, and they fulfilled the contract. And they laid the floors, and they left. Now here's my question. Did they fulfill the contract? After they came and they laid the floors and they left, did they fulfill the contract? They did. Here's the next question. When the contract, after they left, was the contract still in force? No, it wasn't still in force. Why? It had been fulfilled. Now here's the question. Did they destroy the contract? They didn't destroy the contract. You see the point? They didn't come and destroy the contract. If they destroyed it, they would have done away with it. They would have said, we're not honoring it. That's the end of it. They didn't come to destroy the contract. They came to fulfill the contract. But after it's fulfilled, it's no longer in force. That's exactly what Jesus said about the Old Testament. He said, I didn't come to destroy it. I came to fulfill it. Why? Because the Old Testament is all about Jesus. The Old Testament is all about the fact that a Messiah is coming. He's coming to save the world. He's coming through the Jewish people. He's coming. You go back to Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, when Eve committed that sin in the garden. You remember the conversation between the Lord and the serpent? He said to the serpent, you're going to bruise the heel of man, but man is going to crush your head. You know what that was? It's a prophecy about Jesus Christ in Genesis chapter 3, and it was looking forward to the day that Jesus was going to fulfill that. Jesus didn't destroy it. Jesus fulfilled it. Jeremiah 31:31, he said, I'm coming to bring a new law. When he brought that new law, he said that the other may be done away. Jesus didn't destroy that. He fulfilled it. And when he fulfilled it, the old one was done away. See, I think sometimes we get stumped because a person will say something like this, well, Jesus said that the old law is still in effect because he said, I did not come to destroy the old law. And we're kind of stumped thinking, wow, that's what he said. He didn't come to. But if you can use a simple illustration like that to show, then we can get it. All right, we're past time. Thank you for your attention very much. I appreciate it.